or David or any of the prophets. No mention of any of the sacrifices or the word prayer is not found in this book. Nothing. There's no theology or doctrine or, thou shalt do this. Nothing like that in this book. In fact, if you read it through, it's basically just a historical account of this one event that took place. It reads kind of like a fast-paced novella, one of those short novels. So, given that there is not one mention of God or the law or anything like that, why is this book in the Bible?
It's to show God's providence for his people.
God's what?
Providence for his people.
That's the theme of the book, providence. I was going to say, if nobody knew that, I was going to say, what's the capital of Rhode Island? But that's the theme. That's the key word of this book. It's God's providence.
Well, you had to keep it going so that we could have the Savior.
It makes me wonder if Jesus' lineage came through somebody in this town, Susa, and not one of those that was maybe already back in Jerusalem. You're absolutely right. I think this all happened maybe to preserve the messianic lineage that would take place. So we're just going to blaze through this book. It's 10 chapters, and obviously we don't have time to read every verse of every chapter, but I'm just going to kind of go by a chapter recount what happens. As you know, the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon for 70 years, and then the Persian king Cyrus took over and liberated them. They were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Some stayed in Jerusalem, some stayed in Babylon, and some were here in Susa, which is actually even the northern part of Iran, if I'm not mistaken. My geology's maybe not up on that. Geography, I mean. But some are still over here in the former kingdom, the Persian kingdom. And the king at this time, his name is Xerxes. He's got a wife. She's the queen. Her name is Vashti. And back then, the protocol said you could not come before the king unless you were summoned, directly ordered to. So he's got a feast. A lot of fancy people are there at this feast, and he summons his wife, Queen Vashti, to come join them. He wants to show her off. Evidently, she's very beautiful. And she doesn't come. The Bible doesn't give any reason why she doesn't come. She just says no. And so this obviously infuriates the king, and so he consults all of his advisors and counselors, and they're like, yeah, you can't let this stand. It shows insubordination towards the king, and next thing you know, all the women in the kingdom will be rebelling against their husbands because, hey, look, Queen Vashti did it to the king, and so, you can't let this stand. So he removes the throne, or removes her crown and removes her from the throne, and she is no longer queen, and she is no longer to ever be in the presence of King Xerxes again. So I don't know if she's banished from the kingdom or not. It doesn't say. So that's chapter 1. Kind of gives you the lead up to what comes in chapter 2. A search is put out to find a new queen. And so his advisors tell him, why don't you just round up all the young, beautiful virgins in the whole kingdom, the whole territory, and just bring them in, and just kind of reminds you of The Bachelor, right? And just have pick which one you like to be queen. So they do that. And there is this one young Jewish girl. Her name is Esther. She's an orphan. Both of her parents have passed, and she has been raised by an older cousin named Mordecai. And of course, now, like I said, the book does not mention God or the law or anything, but we're going to see that evidently Mordecai has been raising her according to the scriptures, according to the law, seems to be a very faithful man. So she is brought in with this whole group of young ladies, and before they can go before the king to be chosen for whichever one's going to be the new queen, they have to undergo 12 months of beautifying treatments. 6 months of oil of myrrh and 6 months of spices and ointments. Wow. It says in chapter 2, verse 15, that she continued to win favor with all who saw her. Now, evidently, she was a very attractive young lady. But several times throughout here, you're going to see this phrase, she won favor with everybody who was over her, who was overseeing her beautifying treatments. She was given the best room in the harem. She was given the choicest foods, and she was even given 7 attendants to attend to her personally. Which makes me want to hit the pause button here a little bit. And what qualities do you think she might have had that allowed her to win favor with everyone she met? I mean, it says she was a young, beautiful lady, but obviously looks isn't everything. What do you think, when you picture Esther in your mind, what kind of personality do you think she might have had?
She's pleasant to be around.
Pleasant to be around. Kind. Humble and gracious.
Thoughtful of others.
Thoughtful of others. Probably a good sense of humor. Probably could take a joke. Probably could just, we all know those kind of people. It's easy to like those people. Well, evidently she made a good impact on King Xerxes because he chose her, made her queen, and a feast is declared. Gifts are given with royal liberality. And one version I read said that a remission of taxes was granted. And I think the English Standard Version says that. So that's pretty good side effect of the choosing of the new queen. So as she's been undergoing these treatments, these beautifying treatments and everything, getting ready to be chosen, her old cousin Mordecai, the one who raised her, comes down every day and hangs around the king's gate to keep tabs on her, just see how she's doing, kind of keep a watchful eye on her. Evidently, he's very concerned about her. One day while he's down there, and it never tells us exactly how he does this, but he overhears or discovers a plot made by 2 of the king's servants that they're wanting to assassinate King Xerxes. So he passes a message on to Queen Esther, his young cousin, and she eventually passes it on to King Xerxes. They investigate it and they find out that this conspiracy is true, that these 2 guys are planning a coup, and the 2 conspirators are hung on the gallows. Now, every version I read said hung on the gallows. Got to read more. This is not gallows like a rope in a trap door and you drop and breaks your neck. Back then, when you were hung, you were impaled on a skewer, and then the pole was hoisted up and your body was left there to hang as a warning to anybody else who might give thought to doing whatever they did. So right here, I think we have the first item of, as Billy said, providence. Something had to happen, and we're going to see this play out, to get Mordecai's name on an official record so that the king could later come back and recognize Mordecai. When all this happens and those 2 guys are caught and impaled, it's all recorded in the annals and in the chronicles of the king. But nothing is done for Mordecai then. He's not rewarded. He's not acknowledged in any way of saving the king's life. So I think this is the first incidence of providence where something had to happen to get Mordecai's name written down so that later on he could be acknowledged for this. And that ends chapter 2. Chapter 3, a guy come around, his name is Haman. Very arrogant, conceited man. Evidently he's high ranking in the kingdom somehow. It really doesn't say. I don't know if he was a warrior or a soldier or some prominent politician. Anyway, he's promoted by King Xerxes to be second in command. He's given a throne there in the throne room. And the king makes the rule that everybody has to bow down and acknowledge him when he walks by, in and out of the palace every day. Well, who's down there every day keeping a close eye on his cousin? Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to bow down to this man. And again, no mention in this book of the law or the covenant, but what commandment do you see in Mordecai that he's following here by refusing to bow down to What's that? Obedience. Was that the first or second commandment of the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt not worship any other idols or anything except the Lord your God. He's holding fast to the Jewish teaching that evidently had been taught to him, that had been retained in his family through the captivity and now through these years after the captivity. He refuses to bow down and worship this man. Now, I think later on this week we're going to study about 3 young men who kind of did the same thing. Anybody know who that is? Be Abednego. What was their fault, so to speak? What did they get in trouble for?
They're praying 3 times a day and told not to.
Right.
Well, they refused to bow down to a golden image.
The king said, this king says you have to bow down to Haman. That king said you have to bow down to this golden image I've built. And they said, no. Wouldn't it have been easy for Mordecai, and I don't want to take away from whoever's teaching Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I think it's Wednesday night, but wouldn't it have been as easy just to bow down and say, oh, whatever. It's not in my heart. I'm not worshiping women in my heart, but just to go along with the flow.
Well, there's an example you said in here, not only morality for himself, but for his people.
Right.
So he can't bow down, because even though this is just the king's command, and Haman's making play on that, you're transgressing the king's command.
Right.
Because he wants them to bow down to him. You know, you're just a mere man. He serves God. No, it doesn't say God.
Right. Exactly. So the king's servants came and they noticed Mordecai's not bowing down. They say, why aren't you bowing down to the king? And evidently in the conversation, he reveals to them that he's Jewish. Now, I forgot to mention, when Esther got chosen to be the queen and went through all of that trying out period to be the queen, she kept it secret that she was a Jew. It was not known. Mordecai had warned her, don't let anybody know that you're Jewish. I guess that could have caused some problems, so she didn't. So right here, Mordecai evidently tells the king's servants, well, I'm Jewish. I can't bow down. It violates one of the 10 Commandments. So they pass this on to Haman. And rather than Haman saying, well, take this man out and kill him, Haman comes up with the idea that all the Jews need to be killed. So he persuades King Xerxes to pass this law saying that all the Jews and all the territory, the whole kingdom, need to be annihilated. Sound familiar? Recent history. So the king signs that edict, and they cast lots to see when this was going to happen, because obviously this is going to take some planning and coordination. And it ends up being about 11 or 12 months in the future. So it's almost a year ahead. They're going to kill all the Jews. And they put a notice out. Approximately 1 year from now, we're going to exterminate and annihilate all the Jews. And as you can imagine, this sets the Jewish community on edge. There's a lot of grieving, a lot of confusion. And the end of chapter 3, it says, the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. I think one version said thrown into confusion. So that's where we are at the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4, Mordecai finds out, along with all the Jews in the area, and there's great mourning, there's fasting, there's weeping and lamenting among the Jews. I think it's strange here that it's also there's no mention of prayer, but I can only imagine that these faithful Israelites probably did some praying. Queen Esther is evidently unaware of this edict by Haman and the king, and she finds out from Mordecai. Somebody told her, hey, your cousin Mordecai's sitting out there dressed in sackcloth and ashes and mourning. She's like, well, send him some clothes. So she sends him some clothes. He refuses to wear them, sends a message back saying, don't you know why we're mourning? This rule has been made that we're all going to be exterminated in a year. And he wants her to go before the king and plead for an appeal to save him. Queen Esther says, I can't go before the king without being summoned. If anybody goes before the king without being summoned, they're killed. and she hasn't been summoned in 30 days, she says. Mordecai then reminds her, he goes, look, if this goes down, not only are all of us Jews going to be killed, but don't think you're going to be spared either because you are Jewish. You're my cousin. If I get killed, you get killed. And just because you're the queen, it's not going to give you any special favors. And then in chapter 4 of Esther, verse 14, he says something which I think is very powerful. And who knows but that you have been come to this royal position for such a time as this? Which I think this is one of the pillars of this book. Talking about providence again. Are we ever put into circumstances or situations that maybe are used or come about to fulfill a divine purpose?
We may not acknowledge it, but I believe we are. You know, why did I come in contact with this certain person?
Right.
I was driving down the road in Utah, going to a game reserve, and just happened to look off on the side of the road there, and little water lilies and stuff, and I thought I saw a hand. So we stopped. He said, what's going on? I said, I thought I saw somebody laying in a ditch back there. So we backed up, and sure enough, there was a man who missed a curve on a motorcycle and was thrown into the ditch and was unconscious. He just had just enough to go like that, and I saw it. Well, 4 or 5 cars behind us, there was a registered nurse. We all stopped, rendered aid to the person, and took him off to get him help and everything. Unfortunately, he did die in the situation, but at least somebody came to his aid and tried to get him help. And out of the providence of God, nowhere, why did I look in the ditch and see this hand and acknowledge the fact that it was a hand?
Right.
And it's amazing me that things like that happen.
I think we have to consider that a lot of times before we're put in an uncomfortable situation. When something comes into our life that's unfortunate, that's a negative event, a lot of times our first instinct is to ask God to get us out of it. Lord, get me out of this. Remove this problem, remove this disease, remove this whatever. But maybe it would be prudent of us to stop and say, whoa, maybe this has come into my life for a reason, for some purpose of God to be fulfilled. Is that right? I think we might have to, I think maybe that's why we always have to ask, Lord, if it's your will, was in the book of James, said, ask anything according to, if it's your will, get me out of this. But it might not be God's will to get us out of that time. Maybe we're there to find somebody in trouble or to whatever we have to do to fulfill his purpose.
There are no accidents.
No accidents. I had a point later on, but I'm going to go ahead and jump to it since you mentioned that. Do we ever find ourselves using the term, well, in Billy's case, well, he's lucky he found that guy. Well, we're lucky whatever. A couple months ago, my family and I, we were in a car wreck down in Texas, hit the front quarter panel. The first instinct is to say we got lucky that it didn't hit midway in the car. T-bone us, because Karen and Maddie would have been in big trouble. I think as Christians, we might ought to say God has a reason. Providence of God, that word providence coming back up. There are no accidents. It's providence. And I'm wondering as Christians if maybe we should maybe pause before we ever say, well, we were lucky that blah, blah, blah. Or I was lucky that this turned out this way. Maybe luck is not a part of it. Maybe it's not an accident. There's a purpose for this happening. Agree? Disagree?
Look at them as teachable moments.
What's that?
It's a teachable moment.
Teachable moment?
I learned from whatever happened.
Right.
I think our problem is we can't prove it one way or the other. We can't prove that it was providence, we can't prove that it wasn't.
Right.
So we have this idea of luck that, well, if it happens and it's good, then it's luck.
Right.
But was it luck? Solomon said time and chance overtake us all, and I never have figured out what he means by chance. Are some things by chance? But there's, like you were saying, like you introduced this book, there's just too many things in here
Right.
to be, I mean, one, one occurrence might be chance.
Right.
But the more occurrences that get strung along, that's why evolution can't be true.
Right.
There's no way. Well, other than the fact that God says he made us all.
Right.
Well, and at least a chance to glorify God, whether we can prove it or know it is or not, is a chance to give him glory that we're prepared or blessed with good health or we're alive or whatever circumstance is. A chance to acknowledge him and give him glory that good things happen to us.
Well, anyway, Esther says, I can't go before the king. Mordecai says, you've got to, you won't be spared. Besides, you might have been put here for this purpose. So Esther asked Mordecai, she said, I want you to hold a feast on your behalf. Or I'm sorry, hold a fast on her behalf. Nothing to eat or drink for 3 days. Chapter 4, verse 16, which is interesting. 3 days without drinking. If anybody knows anything about survival, there's a rule of threes. You can go roughly 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. It's interesting that there's a fast here of nothing to eat or drink for 3 days. That would be, if you don't have any liquid going down your throat for 3 days, you're getting close to the edge of survival there. Pardon? Parched, exactly. So I think this is a serious fast. 3 days without food or water. And she says her and her servants will do the same. Now the theme of this VBS is bravery and courageous acts and courageous people. I think this is where Esther shines through. She says, okay, I'll go before the king, unsummoned, and even though it's against the law and it might be a risk to my life. And she says in chapter 4, verse 16, I will go to the king even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. How brave is that?
That's actually stepping out on faith.
It is, isn't it?
That's true faith.
Yeah. She could just as easily go before the king and he say, I didn't summon you. I mean, he's got all these other beautiful women that were brought in to be his queen. It's not like she's not expendable.
And she has things good where she is.
Yes,
She's got servants. She's got all she can eat.
absolutely. She's got it made in the shade for the rest of her life, pretty much. But if she steps out on this, it is a leap of faith. Exactly. I think this demonstrates the brave attitude that God's people need to have. When the tough times come, we need to pray, we need to fast, and we need to trust God. We don't talk a lot about fasting anymore, do we? It's not a big thing, but even Jesus says this in his Sermon on the Mount. It's almost like a prayer booster. When you pray for something, you're bringing it before God, that's powerful. But when you fast and pray, I think it proves to God you're even more serious about what you're praying for. But it's funny right here, the fast is mentioned, but no mention of prayer. And whoever wrote this book, they don't mention that.
Do you think that, and obviously this is speculation, that's an indirect reference to faith in God? Because why would you fast? There's no mechanical, physical advantage to
Right.
fasting that would bring this plan along. But the only thing you'd be appealing to is something of a spiritual nature.
Exactly.
And there's no other reason for fasting.
There's nothing in the going without food or water that's going to make the situation work out to your advantage. It's not going to prove anything to the king.
You'll just
So-
die hungry 3 days later.
You'll die hungry 3 days, dry parched 3 days later. Exactly. So yeah, I think unsaid, it shows that they're appealing to a higher power. Absolutely. So chapter 5 begins. After 3 days of fasting, Esther gets dressed up in her royal robes and goes before the king unsummoned. But he doesn't kill her or have her arrested. It says she wins his favor. He holds out his scepter and asks her for what she wants, even up to half his kingdom. So she says, hey, I would like to invite you and Haman to a feast I've prepared for you today. And so he goes, okay. And so they come to the feast. He asks her again, what do you want, even up to half my kingdom? And she says, come tomorrow. I'm going to prepare another feast for you and Haman, and I will let you know what I want tomorrow at that feast. And they go, okay, we'll see you tomorrow. Now, this one-day delay here, I think, is another point of providence in this story. Haman leaves, and he's walking on cloud 9 because he thinks, I've been invited as a special guest to the king and queen to a feast, and I am hot stuff. And he walks out the gates, and there's Mordecai. And everybody bows down to him as he's leaving, except Mordecai. Now, don't forget, this rule has been put in effect. Several months from now, there's going to be an annihilation. And even knowing that, Mordecai's still not bowing down to him. Chapter 5, verse 10, Haman goes home, and he is pouting. He admits that he has everything he wants, everything he needs. He's second in command in the kingdom. But this rascal Mordecai still will not bow down to me, and he is fuming about it. What does pride and arrogance and hatred do to us? I mean, this is not the main point of this lesson, but this is just a good example. When you're that prideful and that arrogant, and you have everything you want and need, but this one little person won't acknowledge you for, why didn't he just say, he'll be dead in 6 months anyway, I'm going to have him annihilated? But he didn't. It ate at him. So he goes home and talks to his wife and family members, and they give him the idea to, why don't you hang or impale old Mordecai on a gallows or on a skewer 75 feet high. Can you think of another example in the Bible where a high-ranking official has everything he wants, everything he needs, except this one little thing over here, and he goes home and pouts about it, and his wife gives him the idea to kill the guy? Ahab and Jezebel, which is part 2, isn't it? I mean, this is the same story. Ahab wanted a Naboth's vineyard and couldn't have it, so he went home and pouted, and Jezebel arranged that feast where they falsely accused him of cursing God, and they had him killed for it. Well, here, old Haman's wife, I mean, she doesn't even put up the guise of a feast like that. She just says, why don't you just kill him? So they do that. They're going to build a skewer 50 cubits high, which is about 75 feet, and they're going to impale old Mordecai. Chapter 6. Providence again rears its head here in the form of insomnia. You ever thought insomnia would be an act of God? Well, it is right here. King Xerxes cannot sleep that night, so he gets up. And probably to help induce sleepiness, he goes and grabs the records, the Chronicles of the King, opens it up, and finds out, oh yeah, back a while back when those 2 guys wanted to have me killed, this guy named Mordecai is the one who turned it in, who called the tip line. And he asks around, he goes, what did we do for this guy Mordecai who saved my life, saved my kingdom? And they tell him nothing was done for him. So Mordecai's thinking, or King Xerxes is thinking, I need to do something to acknowledge his heroism. About that time, Haman arrives for that second feast on that second day. And he comes in, King Xerxes says, Haman, I got a question for you. What should be done for a man who the king delights to honor? What does Haman think? It's him. Oh boy, king really likes me. Well, I tell you what, he should be dressed in a robe. A big party should be thrown. They should put a crown on his head, and he should be led around town on one of the king's private horses. Proverbs 16, verse 18 through 19. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be lowly in spirit among the oppressed than to share plunder with the proud. Haman tells the king what he thinks should be done. And the king goes, that's great. I want you to go do that for Mordecai out there on the front steps. Wow. I've never eaten crow, but
Can't make this stuff up,
you can't. Haman has to just, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall and see Haman's reaction. So Haman does what he's told. He goes out there, he puts Mordecai, the man who he's privately building a gallows to kill, the one man who refuses to bow down to him, and he has to put him on one of the king's private horses, put a crown on his head, put royal robes on, and leads him around town yelling, this is what happens to the man who the king delights to honor. Wow, that had to be a tough morning. Chapter 6, verse 12. Haman runs home afterward, mourning and with his head covered. Chapter 6, verse 13. Haman's wife and his friends who gave him the advice to do what? Kill Mordecai? When he tells them what has happened, they're like, yeah, it's not looking good for you, buddy. So chapter 7, Haman goes to Esther's second feast. So again, the king offers up to her half his kingdom. Esther makes the request that her life be spared in the coming extermination. She reveals that Haman is behind the plot to kill all the Jews, and the king absolutely goes ballistic and walks out of the room. Now, the protocol in those days, the only person who could be left alone with a woman of the royal court was the king. If the king walked out, everybody else had to walk out too if the queen was there. In other words, you could not be alone with the queen when the king's not there. So King Xerxes leaves the room, and it's just Haman and the queen in there. And he goes over and falls on her couch where she's evidently reclining and is begging her, because he knows when King Xerxes leaves, he knows the king's going to kill me for this. My hours are limited here. I'm living on borrowed time. And he's begging for his life from Queen Esther. The king walks back in and says, what? Are you throwing yourself at my wife? Are you assaulting her on the couch? So Haman is then arrested. The king is then told that, Haman is building this skewer out here. He's going to impale Mordecai on it. And King Xerxes says, is that right? Now we're going to hang old Haman on it. So Haman is taken out and impaled on the very skewer that he was having built for Mordecai. Now I know the word karma is not in the Bible, but is there a biblical principle of karma, do you think? As a man sows, so shall he reap. Do unto others as you would have do. I wonder sometimes.
When Paul writes about that in Galatians, he said, God will not be mocked.
Yes.
In other words, he's not going to allow an opportunity for anybody to say, ha, 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 I got away with this. And that's why I think, you mentioned karma, I think that's why karma became a thing, because people realized that reality is so fixed in life that we're going to give a name to it.
Right.
Even if they don't know anything that God said about it. And it's interesting. We think of providence as working in behalf of God's people, which it does. But in Haman's case, it was all providence that led to his downfall. And it was his own behavior, of course. Right. But he behaved in such a way that God provided that his behavior would be his undoing.
Be his undoing.
And that helps me sometimes when I wonder what's going to happen to the people who are evil. Well, right. God will provide. Just like he provides for the good, he'll provide for the evil. I don't often think about it like that.
Yeah, you mentioned it's a reality of life, that this what goes around comes around. As you sow, shall you reap. It transcends other religions. Think, what is it, Hinduism, where karma is a big deal of their faith. Everybody recognizes that, and it transcends even other world religions that don't even believe in God. So, Haman is impaled, skewered up on Mordecai's skewer, and Esther is appointed over Haman's estate. It was a kind of a thing back then that if a person was a conspirator against the king, then his estate would go to either the kingdom or to the person who revealed it. and in this case it would be Esther. She reveals her relationship with Mordecai finally to the king, introduces him as her cousin, evidently now comes out and admits, or reveals that she's Jewish, and asks the king, or the king actually gives Mordecai his signet ring. Now, a signet ring is very important in those days, because what you would do is you would pass a law, write it on the parchment or paper, whatever, put hot wax on there, put that signet ring on there, it dries in the wax, and that's the king's word. That's the law. That's as official as it gets. So he gives that ring to Mordecai. And Esther pleads with the king to revoke the order for the annihilation of the Jews here in a couple of months. But the king reveals that once an edict is signed and sealed, once that's stamped, it cannot be revoked. But he allows Esther to issue a decree stating that the Jewish people will now be allowed to defend themselves and fight back if indeed they are attacked and the attempt to annihilate them comes around.
Shannon,
Yes.
I was in Franklin, might have been August class, but
It
this
was
year.
good, I'm sure it was.
It was good. But this, Haman, this Hagite, was he not from a family that caused a lot of problems later on to the Jew?
I don't know. Maybe it was my class.
I read that
I'm with that.
in researching this. I've got the archaeological Bible at home. It's the Bible with a lot of archaeological history background. And was it the group of people that Saul, I'm not going to say because I'll get confused, but you're right. It's from an old tribe of people that caused problems for the Jews. And here he is, hundreds of years later, causing problems. So all through the Old Testament. No, you didn't. I remember reading that, though, and preparing for this. I just didn't write it down. There's been a lot of attempts to annihilate the Jews throughout the Old Testament. This was the last one that's recorded. So a decree is issued stating that the Jewish people will be allowed to fight back and defend themselves. And chapters 9 and 10, the last two chapters, it's a bloodbath. The Jews fight back and destroy their enemies. They go after Haman's 10 sons. He had 10 sons, and they are all impaled up on a skewer. And this is where the observance of a Jewish holiday called Purim. Has anybody ever heard of that? Maybe you see it on a calendar. Purim is established. When Haman was trying to decide when they were going to annihilate the Jews, they cast lots. And I guess the word for lot, or for rolling the dice, or whatever they did to figure out what day it was going to be, was called the Pur, P-U-R. And so Purim was a holiday established for the Jews to remind them of the time that they were singled out for annihilation, but Mordecai and Esther come to their rescue. In fact, it's still celebrated today. This book is still read in the Jewish community around this time, and every time Mordecai's name is mentioned, people cheer, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, they hiss. It's added to the 5 feasts that God ordained as a celebration of God's covenant and faithfulness. And Mordecai went on to reign second only to the king. Do you think it's possible Esther and Mordecai, as the years went by after this, they looked back and took note of how God worked things out in their lives? I mean, all this, it started off at the very beginning, her being an orphan, and then being raised by Mordecai, who was evidently a devout Israelite, Jewish, raised by his godly standards, because Mordecai imposed those on her. And then all these events that took place. As we get older, do you ever look back on events and think, that's why that happened? That's why that worked out the way it did?
There's something about her personal character too, because she was an orphan, but she didn't become bitter, and she didn't become self-involved or have any of the psychological problems that people have when they just resign themselves to depression. And I'm not saying everybody who's depressed has resigned themselves to it, but you see where I'm going with this. She had some kind of a sweet, kind spirit that it said in one place we've looked at where she was considered favorable in everybody's eyes. And then when she goes before the king, endangering her life, it says she found favor with the king. There was something about her personally, and God used her, and that, I guess you call it demeanor she had. Mm-hmm. Just like David, he got in Saul's presence because he could play the music, right, soothe him, and then he was able to kill Goliath because he had the skill with a sling. And I think God does that with each one of us. He puts us in places. I can't prove that, but I know He's the most efficient worker I've ever known. And if He's got a tool, right, which is what each one of us are, He's going to find a place to put us to work. He's putting you to work tonight. Doing a great job.
Well, thank you. It's also noteworthy that after Mordecai went through and they fought back and they destroyed their enemies, in chapters 9 and 10, I mean, like I said, it's a bloodbath if you read through those two chapters. He was allowed to accept the plunder from all their enemies, but he did not. This is another example of him kind of modeling his behavior after Abraham. If you remember, Abraham kind of set this precedent when he refused reward from the king of Sodom because he did not want that wicked city and its material possessions to be the source of his prosperity. Same thing with Mordecai here. He didn't want their money. He didn't want their property, their jewels, whatever. He did not want anything from these wicked people to be the source of his prosperity. His source of pride and prosperity was the fact that he did the right thing, and the king rewarded him for that. And that's why he became second in command. I remember growing up, the preacher I had when I was a kid growing up, those at Ridgecrest, y'all know Kirk Castleman. Remember he once said that he almost considered it blasphemous when Christians would use the term Mother Nature when you describe something. And he goes, there is no Mother Nature, it's God. God uses nature to, work out His creation. But he says, when somebody goes, well, that's just the way Mother Nature is, he said that's almost blasphemous because it's God. And I think that's the same thing, we talked about it earlier. I don't know if it's blasphemous or not, but when we use the term luck or lucky, maybe we need to have pause. Maybe we need to stop and reconsider, is this luck? Now, if you go out here and you shoot a free throw from 50 feet back and it swooshes, nothing but net, yeah, that's luck.
That's a miracle.
It's a miracle. That's right. But something like that probably doesn't have any effect on your life or your soul. Something like that's kind of trivial. That's probably lucky. But when you talk about a car wreck or the fact that the king developed insomnia just that one night, out of all the night, if he'd had insomnia one night later, Mordecai would have been dead.
How many things do you suppose there were to read about in those chronicles?
Exactly. I mean, it's the record of their government. And he read that instance that night that he had insomnia. Would you say Mordecai was lucky? Like you say, there's no accidents. It's providence, which I think is the key word to this book.
Is it the same thing to say fortunate?
I wouldn't think. Fortunate could mean God's put His fortune on you. I think that's the way I would interpret it.
How about winning bingo when the first 5 numbers fall?
That's called gambling. Is this Catholic bingo?
Well, I've done it. I won $1,000.
What you do with money?
I think what I'd like for us to take away from this lesson tonight, like I said, this is 10 chapters, and you could read this on your lunch break. because it reads just like a short story, a short novel. Go home tonight or someday this week, just when you've got, maybe you can read this in 30 minutes. It reads very easy. Just take away from it that things happen at certain times for a purpose that we might not be able to identify right here and now. But 6 months from now, a year from now, 20 years from now, we can look back and say, that's why that happened that way. God was working it out in his providence. Billy?
So mention back personally, I've been hung, I've been buried alive, and I've been shot. Last time, I'll tell you these things here come down to one situation. When I was shot, this guy said, he's not going to make it. Don't worry about getting help. I had that common sense, and I awakened awareness of what's going around me. To tell the guy, get me help now. God is not through with me. And sometimes we got to realize God is not through with us.
Right. I knew some people that on April 19th, 1995, they were supposed to be at the Social Security office that morning when it opened to figure out some stuff with their Social Security. But on the way down there that morning, we need to go by the bank, get some cash. So they made a detour to the bank and missed being blown to bits.
Let me explain that. Being hung, I had 3 brothers. As kids,
That's explanation enough, right there.
my brothers hung me from a tree, and bats killed me. And then being buried alive, it's again, we're digging tunnels in pine, persimmon tree area and boxing in for box tunnels. And it had rained a couple of days earlier, and we were in there, and they were all climbing out. Well, it collapsed and left me in there. And I couldn't get out. I had to get the fire department to get me out. So I was buried alive in about 2.5 hours in pitch dark. Until somebody came and got me out of there. And being shot, I was just in the wrong place at the right time from a robbery. And I got shot twice. And the police officer didn't think I was going to make it and told him not to worry about it. I turned to him and told him, God is not through with me. Get me help now.
He was not the robber.
Glad you clarified that. Thank you.
But you wonder about the providence of God, and you realize God's working in your life, and yes, there's a purpose for each and every one of us here. So,
Is that when God sent Judy?
I think it was.
I did have to get him out of jail once, but that's a whole different story.
Well, we've got time for that one.
I went to work without my driver's license, got stopped on the way home, and they took me to Dale City Jail and held me until somebody brought my license to prove I had a license. We were just dating, so I called her. Her dad let her bring my license.
Boost the contribution you got all these stories.
Well, can anybody beat that? Hung, buried alive, and shot.
And 50 years later, she's still with me.
Amen.
This is quite a story.
I did. Somebody told me to write a book.
That's all I've got. Any questions or comments or observations about this book? Like I said, this is when you read it, you're not going to find any mention of any religious terms or God or the law or Jesus or salvation. Bill?
But it's there.
But it's there.
I was looking at the last thing you said is that he can't undo the original decree. It's like, the wages of sin was death. You couldn't undo that.
Right.
It was already set in stone, but God made a way to work around it. And you see it here in this story as well. They figured out a way to work around it.
Yep.
Sometimes you see God's will by what he does rather than what he says necessarily. For example, I've used the illustration regarding men's role in the church and leadership. Men are supposed to take leadership role. How do you know that? Well, every time God chose leaders through history, he chose men. It was the patriarchal age, and almost all the prophets, except for the exceptions where men wouldn't step up to the plate. Then there were a couple of lady prophets, and all the kings, when they decided they wanted a king, all the priests came from the tribe of Levi and then Aaron's family. All those men who wrote the Bible, there weren't any female authors. When Jesus chose apostles, he chose all men. When Judas fell, he chose another man to take his place. There was an opportunity to make a change. So he didn't have to say, it's got to be men, because he showed us. Every time there was an angel that appeared, it appeared as a man. I know we have this idea of beautiful, we call our wives angels, but if you read the description of the angels, that's not very complimentary. They had several different phases and wings, and they were pretty fearsome creatures. Well, okay, maybe that's true. But you see where I'm going with this?
Right.
I think God does the same thing in Esther. He says, I want to provide a book. I don't know if he does this, but I just have to wonder. If he provides a book and says, I'm going to write this, have this written out, and I'm going to make sure they never mention me or any reference to religion or the law, and see how many people could still see me in this book. And you've made the excellent point tonight. You can't miss it.
Right.
You can't miss it.
If you want a companion book with this, kind of, it'd be Nehemiah, which takes place several years after this. Again, now Nehemiah mentions God and he prays in that book, but God does not work in miraculous supernatural ways. It's like Esther, he works behind the scenes, so to speak. As Nehemiah goes before his king and asks for permission to leave his job and go back and rebuild the wall. And then when he goes back and encounters all the opposition, again, there's no miraculous. I say in these books, God works behind the scenes, and most of the Old Testament, God is not only on the scene, he's center stage. I mean, when he parts the Red Sea or, allows 3 guys to survive a fiery furnace, I mean, that's supernatural. There's no doubt there's God at work there. But in Esther and in Nehemiah, you kind of see him work behind the scenes and how he makes the people in power predisposed to helping God's people succeed. So Nehemiah is a good book to kind of see some of the same traits.
Question?
Sure.
Ever since God brought the Israelites into existence, because that's what he did. He called Abraham, and through him, he created a nation. No people has been more persecuted than the Jews that I can see in history.
Right.
And yet they have not only survived, they have thrived everywhere they've gone, and this book is testimony to that. What about today? What's happening to Israel today? Should we support Israel and try to help them resist their enemies, or should we take a hands-off approach? I'm asking, I'm just throwing that out. I'm not looking for an answer from you. I'm just saying this is something I think is worthy of our thought. To me, it's a very interesting question. Who doesn't know who the Jews are?
Right.
Who doesn't know?
No, God has used government before. King Hazarus, was the head of the government.
I said that was a controversial question. Maybe it's not controversial at all.
It's not. It's everybody who's been against them has been inhumane, almost savagery. They are the most, out of all of their attempts to overthrow, they've been decent people. It's a decent government. It's a decent citizenry. Just politically speaking, I would say we support them because they're a decent country. They have human rights, and they're not trying to be savages like the Nazis were, and everybody else that's tried to overthrow them. Based on the fact to me, they're a good people.
You can find all kinds of Arabs and Muslims in Israel.
Right.
How many Jews can you find in the Arab states?
Right.
And that's just a question pointing us to some facts.
Well, they're living under the 10 Commandments, the law. We're free from the law, but we don't go out and murder people.
Right.
And we don't go out and steal. We don't blaspheme God. So we follow those principles. So they're more like us than not.
Right. We might have differences in faith and religion, and that can be dealt with whenever, whatever.
Exactly.
But at least we have the common God that we acknowledge and we identify with. Difference on the Messiah aspect of it, I guess, but who Jesus was and what he was. Well, thank you for your attention. Is it cookie time?
Let's pray.
Let us pray. Will you bow with me? Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the opportunities like this for Vacation Bible School to not only study your word, but to get our young children fired up about you and to get them enthused and more educated about your will for our lives. We thank you for each one of those kids that are here tonight, and we pray that something will be said or done tonight that will imprint on their souls you and your purpose and your love for them. We ask that you'd be with each one of them and their parents and their family as they go throughout their lives, help them to serve you and love you in every way they can. We ask, Lord, that you would help us to be brave like the people we're studying this week, like Esther tonight, that sometimes it might entail risk to our lives or our well-being or our status to do what's right and to stick up for you, but we'd ask that you'd give us the courage to do that. We'd ask that you would give us faith in you to know that even if it doesn't work out like that, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, that even if their God did not save them from the fiery furnace, that they would not bow down, that even though things might come against us, that we will still stick up for you. We know we're not perfect. We sin and do things and say things and think things that are against your will each and every day. We have a lot of failures, but we know that your grace and your forgiveness is greater than all of those. And we ask, Lord, at this time that you would bestow that on us and bring us closer to you each and every day. Be with us as we leave this place. Keep us safe and in your care till we return. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.